Marcus had been asleep for maybe 3 hours when the alert started. That piercing emergency tone that cut through dreams like a knife through fog, dragging him from the deep sleep he desperately needed after another 12-hour night shift at the warehouse. His phone was screaming at him from the nightstand, the screen blazing with red notifications that made his eyes ache in the dim afternoon light filtering through his curtains. Shelter in place. Do not leave your homes. Avoid all contact with affected individuals. This is not a drill. The words didn't make sense at first, his brain still thick with exhaustion. But then another alert came, and another, each one more urgent than the last, and Marcus fumbled for the remote to turn on the TV. Because whatever this was, it had to be serious enough to warrant waking up the entire city at 2 in the afternoon. The screen came to life, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as he watched scenes that his mind refused to accept as real. People attacking each other in the streets, crowds stampeding through downtown, a news helicopter capturing footage of what looked like a riot, except the people doing the attacking move wrong, jerked and stumbled like puppets with cut strings, and when they caught someone screaming was unlike anything he'd ever heard. The news anchor was trying to maintain composure, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes, could hear it creeping into her voice as she read from the teleprompter about an outbreak of unknown origin, about staying indoors and waiting for further instructions, about how emergency services were overwhelmed and people needed to remain calm. Then someone screamed off camera and the anchor's head snapped to the side, her professional mask cracking completely, and she stood up and ran, just abandoned her desk mid-sentence while the camera kept rolling, showing her empty chair and the chaos erupting in the studio behind it. Marcus stood frozen in his boxers and t-shirt, remote still in hand, watching as channel after channel showed the same nightmare from different angles. His city, the place he'd lived for 6 years, tearing itself apart in real time. He went to his window, the one that looked out over Riverside Avenue 12 stories below, and what he saw made his hands shake so badly he had to grip the windowsill to steady himself. People were running in every direction, cars abandoned in the middle of the street, some still running with doors hanging open. He watched a woman trip and fall, watched 3 figures converge on her, watched her stop moving. Smoke was rising from somewhere to the east, thick and black against the afternoon sky. A police car screamed past, siren wailing, followed by 2 more, then an ambulance, then another, the sound of it all filtering up to his top-floor apartment like the soundtrack to the end of the world. Marcus heard doors opening in the hallway outside, voices raised in confusion and fear, and when he looked through his peephole, he saw his neighbors emerging from their apartments, still in their work clothes or pajamas, all of them gravitating toward their own windows, all of them seeing the same impossible thing. Mrs. Johnson from 12B was holding her youngest daughter, the little girl crying into her mother's shoulder. The 2 college kids from 12D were both on their phones, trying to call someone, anyone, their faces growing more desperate with each failed attempt. Mr. Kovac from 12F, the old man who'd lived in the building longer than anyone and never spoke to a soul, was standing in his doorway with his wife, both of them just watching the hallway like they were waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Marcus made eye contact with Jim from across the hall, the guy he'd shared exactly 3 conversations with in 2 years, all of them about parking spots, and Jim's expression mirrored what Marcus felt, pure, undiluted fear with nowhere to put it. No one spoke. They just looked at each other, these 12 families who'd lived on the same floor for months or years without ever really connecting. And in that moment of shared terror, they all seemed to come to the same wordless conclusion. One by one, they retreated back into their apartments. Marcus heard the sound of deadbolts sliding home, chains rattling into place, the thunk of furniture being dragged against doors. He did the same, locking his door and then dragging his heavy bookshelf in front of it, knowing it probably wouldn't matter, but needing to do something, anything, to feel like he had some measure of control. The TV was still on, now showing a press conference with city officials, a woman in a suit trying to explain that the situation was contained, that people should stay calm, but her eyes kept darting off camera and Marcus could see people moving frantically in the background, could see the lie for what it was. He went to his kitchen and started pulling out everything he had. 3/4 of a box of pasta, 2 cans of soup, some rice, a half-empty jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread that would be stale in 2 days. Maybe a week's worth of food, if he was careful, maybe less. The reality of it hit him like a fist to the gut. He'd been planning to go grocery shopping tomorrow, had been putting it off for 3 days because he was too tired after work, and now that laziness might actually matter. Water. He had water. The tap was still running, and he started filling every container he could find, pots, bowls, empty soda bottles, anything that could hold liquid. The explosion started around 4 o'clock, distant booms that shook his windows and sent car alarms shrieking in the streets below. Marcus didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself, drawn to the window like it was showing him his own execution. The city was burning. He could see fires in 3 different directions, could see a column of smoke rising for what had to be downtown, thick and dark and spreading. The sirens had become constant now, a wailing chorus that never stopped, punctuated by screams and crashes and sounds he couldn't identify and didn't want to. The screaming from the lower floors started around 6, when the sun was beginning to set and the world was taking on that golden quality that Marcus had always loved, that magic hour light that made everything beautiful. Except now it was illuminating horror. He could hear them through the walls and floor, the people who lived below, the ones who decided to make a run for it or who'd been caught outside when everything went to hell. Their screams were different from the ones in the street. Closer, more immediate, more human somehow. He heard pounding on doors, pleas for help, and then sounds that made him back away from his own door and sit on his couch with his hands over his ears like a child hiding from thunder. But he couldn't block it out. No one could. The sounds came up through the vents, through the walls, through the very bones of the building. Someone on the 8th floor was screaming for their daughter. Someone on the 6th floor was firing a gun, the shots cracking through the air until they suddenly stopped. Someone on the 4th floor was breaking down their neighbor's door. And then, floor by floor, the screaming stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, so much worse, because Marcus's imagination filled it with things he didn't want to see. Night fell and the power was still on, the lights in his apartment, a small mercy that he didn't trust to last. The emergency broadcast had stopped being professional, stopped even pretending there was a plan. The last one he saw was just a recorded message on loop, telling people to shelter in place and wait for help, the same words over and over until they stopped meaning anything. Marcus turned off the TV because he couldn't watch anymore, couldn't process anymore, his brain hitting some kind of limit where new horrors just slid off without sticking. He tried to sleep, but every sound made him jolt awake. Footsteps in the hallway, something scraping against the building outside, distant screams that could have been human or animal or something in between. Around midnight he heard it, the sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps in the stairwell, heavy and shuffling, and then pounding on a door somewhere below, and then breaking wood, and then screaming that cut off so abruptly it left a ringing in his ears. Marcus sat with his back against his reinforced door, knees pulled to his chest, listening to the world collapse around him and wondering how long 12 stories of concrete and steel would keep him safe from whatever was rising up from below. His phone battery was at 30%, and he had no way to charge it if the power went out. His food would last maybe a week. His water, if he was careful, maybe the same. And help, if it was coming, felt like a fairy tale he'd stopped believing in somewhere between the 4th floor screams and the loaded silence that followed. The building creaked and settled around him. 12 floors of people either dead or hiding, and Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember what normal felt like, what it was like to worry about being late for work or forgetting to pay a bill, or whether he'd remembered to lock his car. Those small anxieties that seemed impossibly quaint now, relics from a world that had ended while he was sleeping. Dawn was still hours away, and Marcus knew he wouldn't sleep, knew he'd sit here listening and waiting and trying not to think about what came next. He could hear his neighbors moving around in their apartments. The same restless pacing, the same inability to settle. Someone was crying, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Someone else was on the phone, their voice raised in desperation, as they tried to reach someone who wasn't answering. Marcus checked his own phone, saw the battery dropping to 28%, and forced himself to turn it off. The emergency alerts had stopped anyway. He thought about his parents 3 states away, his sister and her family, whether they were seeing the same thing. His throat was dry, and he poured himself water from one of the pots he'd filled, the liquid tasting metallic. He tried to think practically. Food, water, shelter. He had all 3 for now. Medical supplies, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, and some Band-Aids. Weapons, kitchen knives, a baseball bat in his closet. The reality was he was completely unprepared. Had spent his adult life assuming emergencies happened to other people. Around 2 a.m, he heard the sound that would haunt him. Something scratching at the door near the stairwell, a slow, deliberate scraping like nails on wood. It went on for minutes, that rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Marcus realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly, as if making noise would draw attention to his door. The building settled and creaked, all those normal sounds suddenly sinister. When dawn finally came, Marcus was still against his door, his back aching and legs numb. He could hear birds chirping outside, that cheerful sound that felt like a slap in the face. But everything had changed. He could see in the smoke still rising from distant fires, in the empty streets where abandoned cars sat like tombstones, in the figure that stumbled into view on the sidewalk, moving with that same jerky wrongness. The figure swayed in place like it was listening to music only it could hear, then lurched forward in a direction that seemed random. Marcus watched it disappear and felt something shift inside him, some final piece of denial crumbling away. This was real. This was happening. And sitting against his door waiting for someone to save him wasn't planned. It was just a slower way to die. Day 2 began with the emergency broadcast system cycling through automated warnings, the same robotic voice repeating hollow instructions. Remain indoors. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Help is on the way. The voice had a tinny quality that made it clear no one was manning the stations anymore. Marcus stood at his window, watching the city, counting 7 distinct columns of smoke rising into morning sky, turning the sunlight a sickly orange. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, but now he could see more of those figures, dozens wandering aimlessly like they were searching for something forgotten. They moved wrong. With that jerking gait, his brain kept trying to rationalize his drunkenness, but that he knew was something fundamentally different. He'd been watching one figure for 20 minutes, a woman in a nurse's uniform, and she'd walked maybe 50 feet, stopping every few steps to sway before lurching forward. No pattern, no destination, just endless, purposeless movement that was more disturbing than active hunting. His apartment felt smaller on day 2, the walls closer. He'd rationed breakfast, half a bowl of cereal with water instead of milk, and was making his mind accept this would be reality for the foreseeable future. Small meals, careful water, long stretches of waiting. The power was still on, and he kept the TV running on mute for light, even though broadcasts had stopped showing anything useful. Some channels were test patterns. Others showed loop footage from yesterday. One station played old sitcom reruns, the canned laughter echoing like mockery. He turned the volume up just enough to drown out the sounds outside. Constant sirens, occasional explosions, screams that started and stopped suddenly. Around noon, the screaming from the lower floor started, and this time Marcus could place which floor by proximity of sound. 8th floor, maybe 9th. Someone who'd been hiding until now. The screams were desperate. A man calling for help that wasn't coming. Calling for God. Calling for his mother, the words dissolving into incoherent terror before cutting off a finality that made Marcus's stomach clench. He stood frozen, a soupkin halfway to the counter, listening to the silence and trying not to imagine specifics of what had just happened. Someone pounded on the 7th floor, frantic hammering for almost a minute before it stopped. More silence. Marcus was shaking, hands trembling so badly he almost dropped the can. He set it down carefully and backed away from his door, even though nothing was on his floor, even though the 12th floor had stayed quiet. The fear wasn't rational, but it was overwhelming. Whatever was claiming floors below would eventually make its way up until there was nowhere left to hide. He heard his neighbors moving around more urgently now, responding to the same sounds he was hearing, the same realization that the building was being cleared from the bottom up. Someone, it sounded like Jim from across the hall, was dragging furniture, the scrape of wood on floor audible through the walls. Someone else was talking in a low, urgent voice, maybe on the phone, maybe just to themselves. The college kids in 12D had their TV up loud, probably trying to drown out the screams the same way Marcus had been doing. He wanted to go out into the hallway, wanted to see if anyone else was as terrified as he was, wanted some kind of human contact that wasn't filtered through walls and doors, but the memory of that scratching sound from last night kept him frozen in place. Going into the hallway felt like exposure, like making yourself a target. Even though logically he knew the stairwell barricade was still blocking access to their floor. Logically. But logic felt like a luxury he couldn't afford when the world had stopped making sense. The afternoon brought a new kind of horror. The sound of gunfire from somewhere inside the building. Not the distant pops in the street, but close, deliberate shots that echoed through the stairwell. 6 shots in rapid succession, then a pause, then 3 more, then nothing. Marcus counted them without meaning to, his brain cataloging each one like it mattered, like knowing the number would somehow make a difference. Someone on the 6th floor had a gun. Someone on the 6th floor was fighting back. And then someone on the 6th floor went silent, and Marcus knew, without having to see it, that whatever fight they put up hadn't been enough. The power flickered around 4 o'clock, the lights dimming and surging in a way that made Marcus's heart skip. And for a moment he thought this was it. Thought he was about to lose electricity and be plunged into darkness with whatever was in the building. But the lights steadied, held, and Marcus found himself bargaining with a universe he wasn't sure was listening. Just let the power stay on. Just give me that one thing. I won't ask for anything else. Night came early, or maybe it just felt that way. The smoke from the fires blocking out the sun and casting the city in premature twilight. Marcus hadn't eaten lunch, his appetite completely gone, but he forced himself to open a can of soup and heat it on the stove, because he knew he needed to keep his strength up, needed to maintain some kind of routine, even if everything else was falling apart. The soup tasted like nothing, like he was eating warm salt water, but he finished it and washed the bowl and put away like these normal actions could anchor him to sanity. The sound from outside changed as darkness fell, becoming less chaotic and more constant, a low background hum of movement and moaning that never quite resolved into individual sounds. Marcus stood at his window in the dark, not turning on his lights because he didn't want to be visible from the street, and watched the undead moving below. There were more of them now, so many more, filling the streets in a slow-moving mass that reminded him of videos he'd seen of salmon runs, that same mindless collective movement toward nothing in particular. Sometimes they'd cluster around something he couldn't see from his angle. Sometimes they'd spread out, but they never stopped moving. Never stopped. The thought of that endless, restless motion made something in his chest tighten, made him think about what it would be like to be trapped in a body that wouldn't let you rest, wouldn't let you stop, wouldn't let you be anything except perpetually searching for something you'd never find. Around midnight, he heard it. A door opening on his floor, hinges creaking in the silence. Marcus's whole body went rigid, every muscle tensing as he pressed his eye to his peephole and tried to see who was out there. It was Mrs. Patel from 12E, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, standing in her doorway and looking down the hall toward the stairwell barricade. She was still in her pajamas, her hair disheveled, and Marcus could see her shoulders shaking even from this distance. She stood there for almost a minute, just looking, and then she stepped back inside and closed her door so quietly Marcus barely heard the click of the lock. He understood what she'd been doing, checking, confirming, making sure the barricade was still there and they were still safe, needing that visual reassurance even though opening the door was a risk. He wanted to do the same thing all day but hadn't had the courage. Day 3 dawned gray and cold, or maybe it just felt cold because Marcus hadn't slept more than an hour or two, his body running on fumes and adrenaline that was wearing thin. The emergency broadcast had stopped entirely, every channel showing static or test patterns or nothing. The city's infrastructure finally giving up. Marcus tried his phone even though he knew better, even though the battery was at 12%, and found the cell network was dead too. No signal, no data, no connection except what he could see through his window. The isolation was total, complete. He was locked in a box 12 stories above a city of the dead with 11 other boxes full of people he barely knew, and no one was coming to save them. The thought should have been crushing, but instead Marcus felt a strange kind of clarity, like accepting the truth made it easier to bear. He wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. He was just surviving hour by hour, and that simplified things in a way that almost felt like relief. No more hoping, no more wondering when help would arrive, just the basic mathematics of food and water and time. The sounds from the 4th floor started around noon, breaking the morning silence with a crash of breaking glass and furniture being overturned. Marcus listened to someone, or multiple someones, tearing apart an apartment, the destruction going on for almost an hour before it stopped as abruptly as it started. He tried not to think about whether there had been people in that apartment, tried not to imagine them hiding in a closet or under a bed while their home was destroyed around them. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than knowing for certain, because his imagination filled in the blanks with the worst possible scenarios. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than knowing for certain, because his imagination filled in the blanks with the worst possible scenarios. He noticed the college kids from 12D going to their peepholes more frequently, saw the brief darkness as they blocked the light, and realized everyone on the floor was doing the same thing, checking, monitoring, trying to maintain some sense of control through observation. They were all developing the same habits, the same survival behaviors, like animals in adjacent cages responding to the same stimuli. Marcus wondered if they were thinking the same thoughts he was, running the same calculations about food and water and time, wondering how long they could last like this before something broke. Either the barricade, or their minds, or their bodies. He found himself staring at his reflection in the darkened TV screen, barely recognizing the face looking back at him. 2.5 days of fear had aged him, carved lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before, giving him a haunted look that reminded him of combat veterans he'd seen in documentaries. Except he hadn't fought anything, hadn't done anything except hide and listen and try not to break. Some kind of warrior he'd turned out to be. The thing that finally shattered the careful isolation of day 3 came just before sunset, a scream from the stairwell, close enough that it had to be on the 11th floor, maybe even the landing right below them. It was followed by pounding, desperate, frantic pounding on what sounded like a door, and then more screaming words this time. Please. Oh, God, please let me in. They're right behind me. Please. A woman's voice, raw with terror, begging for help that no one was giving her. Marcus heard doors opening on his floor, heard his neighbors emerging, and before he could stop himself, he was at his peephole watching Jim and Mr. Kovac standing in the hallway, both of them frozen, listening to the woman scream and scream and scream. The pounding stopped. The screaming changed pitch, became something animal and agonized, and then it stopped too. The silence that followed felt alive, felt like it was pressing against Marcus's door, trying to get in. Jim and Mr. Kovac stood in the hallway for another moment, looking at each other with expressions Marcus couldn't read from this distance. And then they both went back inside their apartments and locked their doors. No one spoke. No one acknowledged what they just heard. They just retreated back into their boxes and tried to pretend that the sounds of someone dying one floor below them hadn't just destroyed whatever illusion of safety they'd been maintaining. Day 4 started with a sound Marcus hadn't heard in almost 72 hours. A human voice, deliberate and clear, coming from the hallway outside his apartment. He jerked awake from where he'd fallen asleep on the couch, his neck stiff and his mind foggy, and stumbled to the peephole to see Jim standing in the hallway dragging his couch toward the stairwell. Just dragging it, grunting with effort, the legs scraping across the floor in long, screaming pulls that echoed to the corridor. Marcus watched for a moment, confused, still half asleep, before the purpose clicked into place and his heart started hammering. The barricade. Jim was building a barricade. Marcus unlocked his door without thinking, the deadbolt sliding back, sounding impossibly loud, and stepped out into the hallway for the first time since this all began. Jim looked up, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cold. And for a moment they just stared at each other, two men who'd lived across the hall for 2 years without ever having a real conversation. "We need to block the stairs," Jim said, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in days. "They're coming up. Slowly, but they're coming. I heard them on 10 last night." Marcus nodded, didn't question it, just went back into his apartment and looked around for something heavy, something that would matter. His kitchen table, solid oak, heavy as hell, the thing he'd cursed every time he'd moved. He flipped it on its side and started dragging it toward the door, the legs catching on his rug, his arms already burning with the effort. By the time he got into the hallway, 3 more doors had opened. The college kids from 12D emerged with their futon mattress, looking young and terrified and determined. Mrs. Johnson from 12B came out with her husband, both of them carrying dining room chairs. The Patel family started bringing out whatever they could move, a dresser, a bookshelf, bags of books to fill gaps. Within 20 minutes, half the floor was in the hallway, and Marcus realized he was seeing most of these people's faces clearly for the first time. They worked in silence at first, each person adding to the growing pile at the stairwell entrance, building it higher and wider and denser. Marcus's table went on top of Jim's couch. The futon mattress got wedged between them. The dresser blocked one side. More furniture kept coming. Another couch from 12G, a filing cabinet from 12H, mattresses and box springs, and anything heavy enough to matter. They were building a wall, crude and chaotic but solid, blocking the only stairwell that accessed the 12th floor. The elevator required a key to reach their floor, something only Mr. Kovac had, and right now that elevator shaft felt like their only real protection. Marcus was breathing hard, his muscles screaming from the effort of moving furniture he'd barely touched in months, when someone spoke behind him. "Should probably introduce ourselves, right?" It was one of the college kids, a skinny guy with glasses who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I mean, we're doing this together. Might as well know who we're doing it with." It was absurd. So absurd that Marcus almost laughed. This moment of social convention, in the middle of building a fortress against the undead. But the kid was right. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. "Marcus," he said, and the name felt strange in his mouth, like he was introducing someone else. "Jim," said Jim, wiping sweat from his forehead. "This is my wife, Karen, though she's staying inside." The college kid was Tyler, and his roommate was Ben. Mrs. Johnson was actually Mrs. Johnson. Her husband was Robert, and they had 3 kids who were hiding in the back bedroom. The Patel family was Raj, his wife Priya, and their teenage daughter Meena. Mr. and Mrs. Kovac stood in their doorway watching, not helping but not hindering, just observe it with a detached interest of people who'd seen things the rest of them couldn't imagine. The woman from 12C was Denise, late 30s, living alone. The couple from 12A was the Brennans, both teachers, both looking shell-shocked. They went around the circle, 12 apartments, faces and names that Marcus tried to memorize even though his brain felt like it was running on fumes. Some people stayed in their apartments, shouting names through cracked doors but not emerging. Some came out and worked until they couldn't anymore, then retreated. But for that brief window, they were a community instead of a collection of isolated boxes, united by the simple need to survive. The barricade grew into something formidable, a wall of domestic life repurposed as defense. Couches and tables and mattresses stacked and wedged and interlocked until the stairwell entrance was completely blocked. Marcus tested it, pushed against it with his full weight, and it barely budged. Jim did the same from a different angle. Tyler and Ben climbed on top to make sure nothing could come over. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was something. It was a barrier between them and whatever was below, a physical manifestation of their collective will to keep living. When they were done, everyone stood back and looked at what they'd built, and Marcus saw the same mixture of pride and terror on every face. They'd done something. They'd taken action instead of just hiding and waiting. But they'd also committed themselves to this floor, to this strategy, and if it failed, there would be nowhere else to go. One by one, people retreated back to their apartments, the brief moment of community dissolving as quickly as it had formed. Doors closed, locks engaged, and the hallway returned to its eerie silence. Marcus went back inside and collapsed on his couch, his muscles aching and his hands raw from moving furniture, and realized he felt better than he had in days. Not good, not safe, but purposeful, like he'd done something that mattered. Day 5 arrived with change so profound Marcus thought at first he was imagining it. The city had gone quiet, not silent. Silence would have been impossible, but quiet in a way that made his skin crawl. The sirens had stopped. The explosions had stopped. Even the distant sounds of chaos that had provided constant background for 4 days had faded to almost nothing. Marcus stood at his window in the early morning light and listened to the new world, this terrible quiet that meant all the fighting was over, all the running was done. Everyone else was either dead or something worse. The undead below moved through the streets in greater numbers now, hundreds visible from his window, maybe thousands if he could see the whole city. They swayed and stumbled with that same aimless quality. But there was something else too. Patterns. Not conscious patterns. Nothing suggesting intelligence, but patterns nonetheless. They would cluster in certain areas, spread out in others, move in loose formations that looked almost like herding, hunting, looking for the living with whatever remained of their broken instincts. Marcus watched one group of maybe 20 undead cluster around a building 3 blocks away, pressing against the doors, claw at the windows, and he wondered if there were people inside, people like him trying to survive, people who just revealed their presence somehow. The undead stayed there for almost an hour before gradually dispersing, drifting away to search elsewhere, and Marcus couldn't tell if that meant the people inside were safe or if it meant they were already gone. He noticed other survivors too, the living ones, though they were much rarer and harder to spot. Small groups, usually 2 or 3 people, try to move through the streets while avoiding the undead. Marcus watched them use cars for cover, watched them freeze when undead got too close, watched them run when they had no other choice. Some made it out of his field of vision, some didn't. One man tried to cross an intersection alone and got swarmed by a group of undead that seemed to come from nowhere. Marcus looked away before it was over, his stomach churning, but he could hear the screams even through his closed window. The afternoon brought another sound, this one from inside the building. Footsteps on the stairs below their barricade, slow and shuffling, followed by hands pressing against the furniture, testing it, pushing it. Marcus heard it from his apartment and knew every other person on the floor heard it too. knew they were all standing at their peepholes or pressed against their doors, listening to something on the other side of their barrier trying to get through. The pushing went on for maybe 10 minutes, random and sporadic, without rhythm or strategy, just blind pressure against the obstacle. Then it stopped. Marcus waited, barely breathing, for it to start again, but it didn't. Whatever was down there had given up, or moved on, or lost interest. The barricade had held. That night, Marcus allowed himself a small celebration. He ate a full meal instead of rationing. Half a can of soup and some crackers and peanut butter that tasted like luxury. 5 days. He'd survived 5 days. They all had. The 12 families on the top floor had made it through the initial chaos and the collapse and the first wave of whatever this plague was. That had to mean something. He stood at his window as darkness fell, watching the city transform into nightmare. Fires still burned in places, providing the only real light now that streetlights had started failing. The undead moved through shadows, visible only when they passed near flames, their silhouettes jerking and swaying like puppets in a shadow play. The stars were clearer than Marcus had ever seen them over the city, all the light pollution fading as power grids failed and buildings went dark. It was beautiful in a terrible way, this view of the cosmos made possible by the end of the world. He thought about his parents, his sister, everyone he knew outside the city, and wondered if they were seeing the same stars, if they were fighting the same fight, if they were even alive. The cell network was dead, so there was no way to know, no way to reach out. For all he knew, this was it. 12 apartments on the top floor of a building in a dead city, the last people left anywhere. The thought should have been crushing, but instead it felt almost peaceful, this radical simplification of existence. No more worrying about the big picture, just this floor, these people, this moment. Survival reduced to its most basic elements. Around midnight, Marcus heard a door opening on his floor again, and when he looked through his peephole, he saw Mrs. Patel standing in the hallway. But this time she walked to the barricade, stood in front of it for a long moment, then reached out and touched it with one hand, almost gently, like patting the head of a faithful dog. She stood there for maybe a minute, then went back to her apartment and closed the door, and the hallway was empty again. Marcus moved away from his peephole and sat on his couch in the dark, listening to the building settle, listening to quiet sounds of his neighbors existing in their parallel boxes, listening to the terrible silence outside. 5 days down, however many left to go. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine rescue coming. Tried to picture military convoys or helicopters or some organized response that would save them. But the image wouldn't form, wouldn't solidify into anything believable. The world that could mount that kind of rescue felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, a different Marcus. This Marcus, sitting in the dark listening to the dead city below, knew that if rescue was coming, it wouldn't be soon. And that meant learning to live in this new reality. Learning to survive not just for days, but for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. The barricade would hold, or it wouldn't. The food would last, or it wouldn't. They would find a way to make this work, or they would die trying. Those were the only options left, and Marcus found himself strangely okay with that simplicity, that brutal clarity. No more hoping for someone else to fix things. Just surviving, one day at a time, and seeing how long they could make it last. Day 6 started with tension that Marcus could feel through the walls, a collective restlessness that had been building since the world went quiet and showed no signs of rescue materializing. He could hear in the way people were moving around their apartments, pacing more, opening and closing doors and cabinets with more force than necessary, the small sounds of frustration and fear bleeding through the building structure. Marcus felt it himself, this gnawing anxiety that came from sitting still while the world burned, from waiting for help that felt increasingly like a fairy tale someone had told him once, and he'd been stupid enough to believe. 6 days of rationing food. 6 days of watching the undead wander aimlessly below. 6 days of hoping someone somewhere was organizing a response, and nothing had changed except that hope was getting harder to hold on to. Around mid-morning, he heard voices in the hallway, actual conversation instead of the usual silence. And when he looked through his peephole, he saw 3 families gathered near the barricade. The Johnsons, the Patels, and Rick from 12J, the single guy who Marcus had barely noticed before. They were talking in low, urgent tones. And even though Marcus couldn't make out the words, he could read the body language, the agitated gestures and defensive postures of people who'd made a decision and were trying to convince themselves it was the right one. Mrs. Johnson was holding her youngest daughter, the little girl clinging to her mother's neck. Mr. Johnson had a backpack on, stuffed full of what Marcus assumed was supplies. Raj Patel was checking a watch, looking anxious, while his wife Priya stood with their daughter Meena, all of them dressed in layers like they were preparing for a journey. Rick just stood there with his arms crossed, looking determined in a way that made Marcus's stomach tighten, because he recognized that expression. It was a look of someone who convinced themselves that action, any action, was better than sitting still even if the action was suicide. Marcus opened his door before he could stop himself, the sound making all 5 of them turn to look at him with expressions that ranged from guilty to defiant. "You're leaving," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "We have to try," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "There have to be rescue centers, evacuation points, something. The government wouldn't just abandon us. We can't just sit here waiting to starve." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to point out that the government had very clearly abandoned them, that every broadcast had stopped, that no helicopters were coming, that leaving the relative safety of the 12th floor was insane. But he could see in their faces that they'd already had this argument with themselves, had already weighed the risks and made their choice. They were going, and nothing, he said, would change that. The National Guard station is only 8 blocks away, Raj said, like he was trying to convince himself as much as Marcus. "If we move fast, stay quiet, we can make it. Once we get there, once we make contact with whoever's in charge, we can tell them about everyone here, get them to send help. And if there's no one at the National Guard station," Marcus asked quietly. "Then we keep moving," Rick said, his voice hard. "Keep looking. There has to be somewhere safe, somewhere organized. We just have to find it." They started dismantling part of the barricade, carefully moving furniture to create a gap large enough to slip through. Other doors open along the hallway. Jim emerged from his apartment, Tyler and Ben from theirs, Denise from 12C. Everyone watched in silence as the 3 families prepared to leave, this moment feeling both inevitable and terrible, like watching someone step off a cliff in slow motion. Mrs. Johnson hugged her daughter tighter and kissed the top of her head. Mr. Johnson checked his backpack one more time, pulled out a kitchen knife and held it in his right hand like he knew how to use it, even though Marcus was certain he didn't. The Patel family held hands, forming a chain, Raj, Priya, and Meena all linked together. Rick cracked his knuckles, rolled his shoulders, psyching himself up. "Wait," Jim said suddenly, and disappeared back into his apartment. He emerged a moment later with a walkie-talkie, one of those cheap ones from a sporting goods store. "I've got 2 of these. Take one. If you find help, if you find anything, try to reach us. Channel 7. Raj took the walkie-talkie, nodded his thanks, clipped it to his belt. It was such a small gesture, that radio, but it felt massive, a lifeline, a promise that even if they left they weren't completely cut off, that there was still some thread connecting them to people staying behind. Mrs. Johnson went to the gap in the barricade first, moving carefully over the furniture with her daughter still in her arms. Mr. Johnson followed, then the Patels one by one, then Rick. They stood on the other side for a moment, looking back at the faces watching them through the gap, and Marcus saw Mrs. Johnson's resolve waver for just a second before she set her jaw and turned toward the stairs. "Good luck," Tyler called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Thank you," Priya said, and then they were gone, footsteps echoing down the stairwell, fading into the silence below. Jim and Marcus rebuilt the barricade, working quickly and quietly, restoring the gap until the wall was solid again. Everyone retreated to their apartments without speaking, and Marcus closed his door and stood there feeling like he'd just witnessed something final, something that couldn't be undone. He went to his window and waited, watching the street below, looking for any sign of the 5 people who'd just left. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. And then he saw them. They emerged from the building's front entrance, moving in a tight group with Rick in the lead and Mr. Johnson bringing up the rear. They moved quickly but not running, keeping close to the building's wall, trying to stay inconspicuous. Marcus watched them reach the first intersection, saw them pause and look both ways, saw Rick's signal, and they all moved together, crossing the street in a sprint. The Undead noticed. 3 of them, standing idle near an overturned bus, turned their heads in unison like they were connected by the same terrible instinct. They started moving toward the group, that jerky, shambling gait that looked slow until you realized how relentless it was, how they never stopped or hesitated or gave up. Rick saw them coming, and the group changed direction, cutting between 2 buildings, disappearing from Marcus's view. He pressed his face against the window, trying to see where they went, but they were gone. More undead were converging on the area where they'd been, drawn by the movement or the sound or whatever sense they used to detect the living. Marcus counted 12 undead clustering near the spot where the group had disappeared. Then 20, then more, a growing mass of bodies, all focused on that one location. He stood at the window for 2 hours, watching and waiting, hoping to see the group emerge somewhere else, hoping to see them make it to the next block or the one after that. But they never reappeared. The undead eventually dispersed, drifting away in 1s and 2s, but there was no sign of the 5 people who'd left. No sign they'd made it anywhere. No sign they were still alive. The walkie-talkie Jim had given them stayed silent. Around 2 in the afternoon, Marcus heard sound from the hallway again, and looked out to see Jim standing there with the other walkie-talkie in his hand, pressing the button. "Johnson, this is Jim. Do you copy? Over. Static. Patel family. Rick, anyone. This is the 12th floor. Please respond. Over." More static. Jim stood there for another minute, pressing the button every 30 seconds, calling out to people who weren't answering, before finally giving up and going back into his apartment. The silence that followed was worse than any scream Marcus had heard in the past 6 days. It was a silence of confirmed fears, of hope dying, of the realization that leaving meant dying, and they were all trapped here with nowhere to go. Marcus sat on his couch and stared at the wall, trying not to think about Mrs. Johnson's youngest daughter, the little girl who'd been clinging to her mother's neck, trying not to imagine what had happened in those 2 hours after they disappeared from view, trying not to picture Meena Patel, the teenage girl who'd helped build the barricade on day 4 with such determination, reduced to whatever those things outside became after they stopped being human. The guilt came next, irrational but overwhelming. The feeling that he should have stopped them, should have argued harder, should have physically blocked the gap in the barricade and refused to let them through. But he knew that was nonsense, knew they'd made their own choice as adults with full knowledge of the risks. Knowing that didn't make the guilt go away. It just made it sit heavier in his chest, joining all the other weights he was carrying. Evening came and Marcus realized he hadn't eaten all day, his appetite completely gone, but he forced down some crackers and water because he knew he needed to keep his strength up. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in, the ceiling too low, the air too thick. He wanted to go outside, wanted to run, wanted to do anything except sit here waiting for the same fate that had probably claimed the people who'd left. But he stayed put because the alternative was death, and he wasn't ready for that yet. Wasn't ready to give up, even though giving up would be easier than the slow, suffocating dread. Night fell, and the building settled into its new normal. The sound of 10 families instead of 12, the hallway that much emptier, the collective presence that much diminished. Marcus stood at his window, looking out at the dark city, at the fires still burning in the distance, at the undead moving through shadows like ghosts of the world that used to exist. He thought about the National Guard station 8 blocks away, wondered if anyone had made it there, wondered if there was anyone there to find. Probably not. Probably the station was as empty as everything else. Another abandoned building full of abandoned hope. The walkie-talkie crackled to life around midnight, and Marcus's heart jumped before he realized it was coming from Jim's apartment, not his own. He pressed his ear against the wall and listened, heard Jim's muffled voice saying, "Hello? Johnson? Is that you?" More static, and then a voice, distant and broken up, saying something Marcus couldn't make out. Then nothing. Silence. Marcus waited, but the walkie-talkie didn't crackle again. He didn't know if Jim had actually heard someone or if it was just interference. Some random signal bouncing through the dead city. He didn't go ask. Didn't want to see the hope and fear mixed together on Jim's face. Didn't want to have a conversation about what it might mean or might not mean. The next morning, Marcus woke up on his couch where he'd fallen asleep, his neck stiff and his body aching, and realized with a start that he'd made it to day 7. 7 days since the world ended. 7 days since he'd woken up to emergency alerts and watched civilization collapse in real time. 7 days of surviving when so many others hadn't. The number felt significant even though it wasn't. Just another arbitrary milestone in an indefinite nightmare. He heard movement in the hallway and looked out to see Jim standing at the barricade again with the walkie-talkie, calling out to people who would never answer, and Marcus felt something in his chest crack just a little bit more. Day 7 began with a sound that made everyone freeze. A door opening, footsteps in the hallway, but this time it wasn't someone checking the barricade. It was David from 12I, a man Marcus had seen maybe twice in the entire time they lived on the same floor. Now, David stood in the hallway with a backpack and a crowbar, and when Marcus looked through his peephole, he could see determination and desperation mixed together on David's face. Doors open up and down the hallway, and that's when Marcus noticed movement behind David. A woman, heavily pregnant, standing in the doorway of 12I with 3 small children clustered around her legs. "David, please," the woman said, her voice breaking, and Marcus realized this was Naomi, David's wife. "Please don't do this. We can make it work." David turned to look at his family, and Marcus saw his face crumple before he forced it back into something harder. "We're out of food, Naomi. Completely out. The kids haven't eaten in 2 days. I have to try." The 3 children started crying, quiet, desperate sobs, and the oldest boy stepped forward and grabbed his father's hand. "Don't go, Daddy. Please don't go like the others." David knelt down and pulled all 3 kids into a hug. His crowbar clattered into the floor, and Marcus had to look away because the scene was too raw, too intimate. "I'll be back," David said, his voice thick. "I promise. I'll find food and I'll come back. You just have to trust me." He kissed Naomi, kissed each of the kids, picked up his crowbar, and walked to the barricade without looking back. Jim helped him through the gap, and then David was gone, leaving Naomi standing in her doorway with 3 crying children. Marcus wanted to say something, wanted to offer comfort, but what could he possibly say? Naomi gathered her children and went back inside, closing the door softly, and the hallway emptied. Marcus stood at his window, watching the street below, looking for David. Hours passed, 3, 4, 5 hours of nothing. The undead wandered their usual patterns, but nothing seemed to draw their attention. Marcus started to think maybe David had found a different route. Maybe he'd actually made it somewhere. Around 6 o'clock, as the sun was setting, he saw movement near the building's entrance. David emerged, and Marcus's heart leaped before he saw what David was carrying. Bags, multiple bags stuffed full of what had to be food. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. David had made it out and back. Marcus almost shouted, almost called out to Naomi, but then he saw David stop at the base of the building and just stand there, swaying. The bags slipped from his shoulders and hit the ground, but David didn't bend to pick them up. Even from 12 stories up, Marcus could see something was wrong. David started walking again, heading toward the entrance, leaving most of the bags behind, but carrying 2 of them. He disappeared inside, and Marcus ran to his door, listening for footsteps. It took almost 20 minutes. David was moving slowly, stopping on each landing, but eventually Marcus heard him reach the 12th floor, heard him approach the barricade. "Naomi," David's voice called out, rough and strained. "I'm back. I brought food for the kids." Doors opened all along the hallway, and Marcus looked through his peephole to see David standing on the other side of the barricade, 2 large bags at his feet. His arms were covered in bites, deep puncture wounds that had torn through his jacket. His left sleeve was soaked with blood. His face was pale, sweat pouring down, and he was swaying like he could barely stay upright. Naomi emerged from their apartment and screamed. She started toward the barricade, but Jim grabbed her, held her back. "No," David shouted. "Don't come near me, Naomi. You know what this means." The 3 children ran out into the hallway, calling for their daddy, and David's face contorted with pain. "I got food," he said, tears streaming down. "There's a convenience store 3 blocks away. I found canned goods, crackers, juice boxes for the kids. It's in the bags. Just take the bags. The kids need to eat." Jim started pulling apart the barricade, trying to create a gap to pull the bags through, and David backed away. "No, stay back. Don't touch me. Just use something to pull the bags." Tyler appeared with a mop, used the handle to hook the bags, and dragged them through. David watched, his breathing getting heavier, his skin getting paler. "I love you," David said, looking at Naomi and the kids. "I love you so much. Take care of them. Naomi, take care of our babies." "David, no, please." Naomi was sobbing now, still trying to break free from Jim's grip. "Please don't go. Please." "I have to," David said simply. "I can feel it. I can feel myself going. I'm not going to let you see me become one of those things. I'm not going to let that be the last thing you remember." He backed toward the stairs, his movements getting jerkier, less coordinated. The oldest boy broke free and ran toward the barricade, pressing his face against the furniture, reaching through the gaps. Daddy, come back." David stopped, looked at his son, and Marcus saw him mouth the words, "I love you," one more time. Then he turned and stumbled down the stairs, his footsteps uneven and heavy, and Marcus heard him descending, floor after floor, moving away from his family and toward whatever end he'd chosen for himself. The building was silent except for Naomi's sobbing and the children crying and the distant sound of doors slamming somewhere below. And then a single gunshot that echoed up through the stairwell and made everyone flinch. Naomi collapsed, just dropped to the floor, and several neighbors rushed to help her, to comfort the children, to salvage something from this nightmare. Jim rebuilt the barricade with shaking hands, while Tyler and Ben carried the bags of food to Naomi's apartment. Marcus closed his door and sat on his couch with his head in his hands. David's face burned into his memory. The determination and the love and the absolute certainty that he was saving his family even as he destroyed himself. The days that followed blurred together into a grim routine. Day 8, day 9, day 10. Marcus stopped counting after a while, because the numbers didn't matter, only survival mattered. The food David had brought sustained his family, and Naomi shared some of the other families who were running low, a gesture of gratitude that no one expected but everyone needed. The power stayed on, miraculously, though the water pressure had started dropping, and people were collecting what they could in bathtubs and pots. The undead outside continued their aimless wandering, sometimes clustering near the building but never breaching the lower floors. The barricade held. But there was something else happening now. Something Marcus had started noticing around day 11. The Kovacs, the elderly couple from 12F who'd barely spoken to anyone since this all began, were sneaking to the roof. Marcus first noticed it when he heard footsteps overhead, light and deliberate, and realized they were coming from above his apartment. The roof access was at the end of the hallway, a heavy door that was always locked, but apparently the Kovacs had a key. They'd go up in the morning and not come back down until late afternoon, hours and hours spent somewhere above while everyone else stayed in their apartments. Other people started noticing too. Marcus saw Denise watching through her peephole one morning as Mr. Kovac unlocked the roof door and he and his wife slipped through. Jim mentioned it in passing one day when he came out to check the barricade. Said it was strange. Wonder what they could possibly be doing up there for so long. Tyler and Ben speculated they were trying to signal for help. Maybe had some kind of radio equipment or flares. But day after day, the Kovacs kept their routine, up in the morning, down in the evening, never explaining, never inviting anyone else, just disappearing for hours at a time. Marcus became obsessed with it. This mystery that felt important somehow. The secret the Kovacs were keeping while everyone else was trapped in their apartments with nothing to do but wait and worry. He started timing them, noting when they left and when they returned. 7 hours on day 12, 8 hours on day 13. What could they possibly be doing up there? What was worth spending that much time away from the relative safety of their apartment? The mystery gnawed at him through day 14, 15, 16. This puzzle with no solution. This question with no answer. He thought about confronting them, demanding to know what was on the roof. But what right did he have to their secrets? Everyone was coping with this nightmare in their own way. If the Kovacs wanted to spend their days on the roof, that was their business. Except it kept bothering him, kept pulling at his attention. Because in a world where nothing made sense anymore, this felt like something that should make sense, some piece of the puzzle he was missing. On day 17, Marcus heard them coming back down from the roof, and instead of hiding at his peephole, he opened his door and stepped into the hallway. The Kovacs froze when they saw him. Two elderly people who looked like they'd been caught doing something forbidden, and for a moment no one spoke. "What's on the roof?" Marcus asked. Try to keep his voice gentle, non-threatening. "What are you doing up there every day?" Mr. Kovac looked at his wife, and some silent conversation passed between them before Mrs. Kovac smiled, a sad, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing that would help," she said softly. "Nothing that matters to anyone but us." "I'm not trying to intrude," Marcus said. "I'm just curious. We're all stuck here together. Feels like we should at least know what everyone's doing." The Kovacs looked at each other again, and then Mr. Kovac sighed, the sound of someone giving up a secret they were tired of keeping. "Our greenhouse," he said simply. "We've been tending our greenhouse." Marcus blinked, certain he'd misheard. "You're what?" "We own the building," Mrs. Kovac explained. "Have owned it for 30 years. The roof is our private space, has been since we built the greenhouse up there 15 years ago. We never allowed tenants up there. It was our sanctuary, a greenhouse, on the roof. Fresh food growing 12 stories above a dead city." Marcus felt his mind trying to process this information, trying to understand what it meant. "How much food?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Enough," Mr. Kovac said. "If we're careful, if we ration, enough to keep us alive for a long time." Marcus stood there in the hallway, looking at these two elderly people who'd been hoarding hope on the roof, while everyone else was slowly starving, and he didn't know whether to be angry or grateful or what. Before he could figure out what to say, Mrs. Kovac spoke again. "We'll share," she said quietly. "We were going to share. We needed to make sure everything was still viable after being neglected for a week. needed to inventory what we had. But we were always going to share. You're our tenants, our responsibility. Day 18, Marcus woke to the smell of fresh vegetables, impossible and real, and found a basket outside his door. Tomatoes, lettuce, herbs, actual fresh food that hadn't come from a can or a box. He looked down the hallway and saw baskets outside every door, the Kovacs moving quietly from apartment to apartment, distributing their secret harvest like some kind of apocalyptic Santa Claus. But before they could retreat back to their apartment, before they could disappear again, Marcus stepped out into the hallway. So did Jim. So did Tyler and Ben and Denise and the Brennans. One by one, doors opened, and people emerged, and everyone stood there looking at the Kovacs with questions in their eyes. "Show us," Marcus said. It wasn't a demand, wasn't aggressive, just a simple request. "Please, show us what's on the roof." Day 19 started like any other morning. Marcus woke on his couch, his body stiff, went through the motions of rationing breakfast, stood at his window watching the undead wander below. The routine had become almost comforting in its predictability. But when he opened his door to check the hallway, something was different. There was a basket on his doormat, woven wicker filled with vegetables that looked impossibly fresh. Marcus stared at it for a long moment before he bent down and picked up a tomato. It was real, solid and cool in his hand, the skin smooth and red. Fresh food, actual fresh food that hadn't come from a can. He looked down the hallway and saw baskets outside every door, the Kovacs moving quietly from apartment to apartment. Mr. Kovac was placing a basket outside Jim's door, while Mrs. Kovac headed back toward their apartment, trying to leave their gifts anonymously and disappear before anyone could question them. But it was too late. Jim's door opened, and then Tyler and Ben's, and then Denise emerged, and within seconds the hallway was full of people staring at baskets and looking at the Kovacs with expressions that ranged from confusion to hope to desperate need. The Kovac stopped, caught halfway down the hall, and for a moment no one spoke. Marcus could see Mrs. Kovac's hand tighten on her husband's arm, could see the fear on both their faces. It was Marcus who broke the silence, stepping out with the tomato still in his hand. "Show us," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Please, show us what's on the roof." The Kovacs looked at each other, and then Mr. Kovac sighed and nodded. "Follow us," he said, and turned toward the end of the hallway where the roof access door stood. They all followed, Marcus, Jim, Tyler and Ben, Denise, the Brennans, even Naomi with her 3 children, everyone who was left forming a procession behind the elderly couple. Mr. Kovac pulled out a key and unlocked the heavy door Marcus had never seen opened. The stairs beyond were narrow and steep, lit only by emergency lighting, and they climbed in silence. At the top was another door with multiple locks that Mr. Kovac worked through, and then he pushed it open and stepped out onto the roof. Marcus followed and stopped dead, his breath catching at what he was seeing. The rooftop had been transformed into a garden, a greenhouse that stretched across almost the entire surface. Glass panels formed walls and ceiling, creating a protected space where rows and rows of plants grew in raised beds. Tomato plants heavy with fruit, lettuce in various stages of growth, herbs filling the air with scents Marcus had forgotten existed, basil and mint and rosemary. There were fruit trees and large planters, already bearing lemons and limes, peppers and cucumbers and squash, green beans climbing trellises, even strawberries spreading across a dedicated bed. Solar panels lined one section of the roof, and Marcus could see rain collection barrels connected to an irrigation system. It was life, abundant and thriving, 12 stories above a dead city. It was impossible and miraculous and so beautiful that Marcus felt tears prick his eyes without permission. "Oh my God," Denise whispered behind him, and he heard similar exclamations from the others. People spreading out across the rooftop, walking between the raised beds, reaching out to touch leaves and stems like they needed physical confirmation that this was real. Naomi's children ran forward, the youngest one squealing with delight at the sight of growing things, and Mrs. Kovac smiled for the first time Marcus had ever seen, watching the kids discover the garden. "We built it 15 years ago," Mr. Kovac said, his voice carrying across the rooftop. "After I retired, wanted something to do, something to tend. We never allowed tenants up here because..." He trailed off, looking around the greenhouse with an expression that was equal parts pride and sadness. Because it was ours, our private space, our escape from the world. "But the world ended," Mrs. Kovac continued, "and keeping secrets seemed less important than keeping people alive. We've been up here every day since it started, making sure everything survived, inventorying what we have, planning how to make it last." Jim walked along a row of tomato plants, his hand hovering over the fruit without quite touching. "How much food can this produce?" he asked, his voice rough. "Enough," Mr. Kovac said, "if we're careful, if we ration and plan and work together. The solar panels give us power for the irrigation system and the grow lights for winter. The rain collection gives us water. We have seeds saved, can plant new crops. This greenhouse could sustain us for..." He paused, seemed to be calculating. "Indefinitely, as long as the structure holds." Marcus looked around the faces of his neighbors, saw the hope blooming there like the plant around them, saw the weight of despair lifting just slightly from shoulders that had been carrying it for 19 days. Naomi was crying, her hands over her mouth, while her children explored the rows of vegetables with wonder. Tyler and Ben were examining the irrigation system, already problem-solving, already thinking about how to maintain and improve it. Denise had sat down right there between two raised beds and was just breathing deep gulps of air that smelled like growing things instead of fear and decay. "Why now?" Marcus asked, turning to the Kovacs. "Why tell us now instead of day one? We could have been up here this whole time, could have been working together from the start." Mrs. Kovac's expression crumpled slightly. "Because we were scared," she admitted. "Scared that if we told everyone, people would fight over it, would destroy it trying to take more than their share. Scared that desperation would turn this beautiful thing into just another resource to be consumed and depleted. We needed time to prepare, to plan, to make sure we could actually sustain everyone before we offered hope we couldn't deliver on. But David changed our minds," Mr. Kovac added quietly. "Watching him sacrifice himself for his family, watching him choose to die rather than become a monster, watching his children cry for their father, who gave everything to feed them. We couldn't keep hoarding this when people were dying for food. It would have made us monsters too, just a different kind." The group stood in silence for a moment, processing this, and Marcus realized he wasn't angry, couldn't be angry. The Kovacs had their reasons, had their fears, and in the end they'd chosen to share when they could have chosen to stay silent. That counted for something. That counted for a lot. "So what do we do now?" Jim asked, and it was a question they were all thinking. "We work," Mr. Kovac said simply. "We tend this garden together. We establish schedules, rotations, make sure the plants are watered and harvested and replanted. We ration what we produce, so everyone gets their share. We protect this place because it's our lifeline now, our only real source of fresh food. And we survive," Mrs. Kovac added, her voice stronger now. "We survive together as a community for as long as it takes. Rescue will come eventually, has to come, but until then we have everything we need right here. Food, water, shelter, each other. We can make this work." Marcus walked to the edge of the rooftop and looked out over the city, this urban landscape that had become a graveyard in less than 3 weeks. Fires still burned in the distance, smaller now, running out of fuel. The undead still wandered the streets, thousands of them visible from this height, a sea of bodies that had once been people with lives and dreams and futures. The city was dead, The world was broken, and everyone he'd ever known outside this building was probably gone. But up here, 12 stories above the nightmare, life was still growing. Plants were still producing fruit. Water was still flowing through irrigation lines. The sun was still rising every morning to feed the solar panels. The Kovacs had built something that could outlast the apocalypse, had created a space where survival wasn't just possible but sustainable. Marcus thought about David, about the sacrifice he'd made to bring food to his family, about the gunshot that had echoed up through the stairwell. David had died believing his family would starve without him, died not knowing that salvation had been right above his head the whole time. The tragedy of that timing, that proximity to hope, made Marcus's chest ache. But David's children wouldn't starve now. None of them would. They had this garden, this impossible gift, and they had each other. We should establish rules, Jim was saying behind Marcus, already organizing, already planning. Harvesting schedules, water conservation protocols, security to make sure the barricade stays maintained while we're up here. And we need to teach everyone how to tend the plants. Tyler added, make sure the knowledge isn't just with the Kovacs. If something happens to them, the rest of us need to know how to keep this going. Story time for the children, Denise suggested, gesturing to Naomi's kids who were still exploring with wonder. Up here, where they can see growing things, remember what the world used to be like. Keep them human. They were already adapting, already building systems and schedules around this new resource, already thinking like a community instead of isolated individuals. Marcus turned away from the edge and walked back to join the group, stepping into the conversation, adding his own ideas, becoming part of planning. For the first time since the emergency alerts had woken him on day one, Marcus felt something other than fear or despair or numb determination. He felt hope, not naive hope, not the childish belief that everything would magically return to normal, but practical hope, the kind built on solar panels and rain barrels and rows of tomato plants. The kind of hope that acknowledged the world had ended but insisted they could build something new from the ruins. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the greenhouse, and Marcus knelt down next to one of the raised beds and pressed his palm against the soil. It was warm and dark and rich with life, and he could feel moisture just below the surface, could imagine the roots spreading through it, drawing sustenance, growing despite everything. They would tend this garden. They would ration and plan and work together. They would protect this space and each other. They would survive not just days or weeks, but months, maybe years if they had to. And when rescue finally came, if rescue finally came, they would still be here, still alive, still human, still capable of growing things in the aftermath of collapse. Marcus looked around at his neighbors, these strangers who become his family by necessity and proximity, and saw the same determination reflected in their faces. They'd lost so much, their old lives, their certainty, their sense of safety in the world. Some had lost everything. Like Naomi, who would have to explain to her children someday what their father had done for them, why he'd chosen to walk down those stairs and not come back. But they still had this rooftop garden, this community, this stubborn insistence on surviving when survival would have been easier to abandon. They had the tomatoes growing heavy on the vine, the lettuce ready for harvest, the herbs filling the air with the scent of life. They had water and power and each other. And for now, 19 days into the end of the world, that was enough. That had to be enough. Marcus stood up, brushed the soil from his hands, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Not a big smile, not joy exactly, but satisfaction. Peace, almost. The city below was dead. The world was broken, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and fears and struggles. But today, on this rooftop, surrounded by growing things and determined people, Marcus felt his anxiety lift just slightly, felt the weight on his chest ease just enough to let him take a full breath. They would make this work. They would find a way, and until rescue came, they would live Really live, not just survive, in this garden above the undead,